Hello everybody, this is Dr. Tahani Isa. I work as a professor of pathology. I make this video for my students and for any medical student. Hope someone may find it helpful. Overview on cellular response to stress and noxious stimuli. Homeostasis. The normal cell is confined to a fairly narrow range of function and structure by its state of metabolism, differentiation, and specialization, by constraints of neighboring cells, and by the availability of metabolic substrates. It is nevertheless able to handle physiologic demands, maintaining a steady state called homeostasis. This means that normally cells maintain a steady state in which intracellular milieu is kept within a fairly narrow range of physiological parameters. This is called homeostasis. The cells are active participants in their environment, constantly adjusting their structure and function to accommodate changing demands and extracellular stress. And to accommodate this stress, the cell has to change in structure or in function, and we call this adaptation. So the cell has to adapt to any change in the environment to be able to function and to survive, and to change into another steady state called adaptation. And when this stress is relieved, the cell returns back to its normal state. So adaptation can be defined as reversible, functional, and structural responses to more severe physiologic stress and some pathologic stimuli, during which new but altered steady states are achieved, allowing the cell to survive and continue to function. Notice that the first word in this definition is reversible, and this means that the cell can't return back to its normal state after relief of the stress. The principal adaptive responses are hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, and metaplasia. First, the cell can adapt by increase in its size and of course of its functional activity, and we call this hypertrophy, and this is usually occur in permanent cells as the striated muscles, the skeletal muscles, and the cardiac muscle. The cell may also be able to adapt by increase in its number, and we call this hyperplasia. The cell may also decrease in its size and metabolic activity to adapt to the environment, and we call this atrophy. The cell can change its phenotype, and we call this metaplasia. Adaptation. When the stress is eliminated, the cell can recover to its original state without having suffered any harmful consequences. So in the adaptation state, we have to notice that the cell can return back to its normal state if the stress is eliminated. If the adaptive capability is exceeded, or if the external stress is inherently harmful, cell injury develops. So the cell can adapt to a certain limit. If this limit is exceeded, cell injury occurs. Within certain limits, this cell injury is reversible, and the cell can return back to its normal state. But if the stress is so severe or persistent, or rapid in its onset and severe, as sudden cutting of blood supply, in this case, a state of irreversible cell injury occurs and cell death. Adaptation, reversible injury, and cell death may be stages of progressive impairment following different types of insights. The relationship among normal, adapted, reversibly injured, and irreversibly injured cells is well illustrated by the response of the myocardial cells to different types of stress. So if this is the normal myocardial cell, if this cell is exposed to stress, to overload, it will adapt by hypertrophy. And if this is relieved, if the stress is relieved, it can return back to its normal state. If the stress is increased and not relieved, the cell will go into a state of reversible cell injury. And in this state, reversible cell injury, if the injury is mild, the cell can go back to its normal state if this stress is relieved. But if the stress continues or the stress was severe enough from the start, the cell will progress into irreversible state of cell death. Here is sections in the heart, and we can see the left ventricle. This is the normal left ventricle. The normal left ventricle thickness is between 1 to 1.5 centimeter. This is the thickness of the left ventricular wall. This heart was subjected to stress by systemic hypertension. You know, the left ventricle has to pump blood against high pressure. If there is systemic hypertension, so the increased blood pressure makes stress or overload, workload on this left ventricle. This left ventricle, this myocardial muscle will adapt. These fibers, these cells will adapt by hypertrophy. So every myocardial cell here will hypertrophy like this. And in this case, the hypertrophied myocardium will be like this. This is the hypertrophied or adapted left ventricle. See, look at the thickness of the left ventricular wall. It is more than 2 centimeters. This is thickened, adapted, hypertrophic left ventricular wall. If the hypertension is relieved or the aortic valve, this may happen, this increased thickness or this adaptation may occur due to increased level of systemic blood pressure, or for example, narrowing of the aortic valve. Narrowing of the aortic valve will give resistance to the pumping action of blood by the left ventricle, and this will be strained and cause also hypertrophy. So if this process is controlled, if the valve become normal, treated, or the hypertension, systemic hypertension treated and returns to its normal level, and the stress over this left ventricle is relieved, the hypertrophied heart can return back to its normal level. This hypertrophied left ventricle can return back to its normal state. So this is the state of adaptation. But If the stress is not relieved and becomes progressive, or if there become an encroachment on the blood supply, means reduced blood supply to this myocardial muscle due to occlusion of coronary artery, in this case, it will progress to injury of the myocardial cells. And this injury may be reversible injury. And in reversible injury, there is no change. We cannot see a change in the gross or microscopic picture, but it looks like normal. And during this state of reversible injury, if the stress or the blood flow returns to normal, the left ventricle can return to its normal state. But if the occlusion of coronary artery is complete or prolonged and or complete occlusion of the coronary artery, the area supplied by this coronary artery will die, will be subjected to irreversible cell injury and cell death, as this is the final state, and this is the irreversible cell injury. These three sections of the heart, these are stained by triphenyl tetrazolium chloride, an enzyme substrate that color the viable myometrium. If it is viable, it will be colored magenta, like this. This is the magenta color. This is the magenta color because it is viable. But if we look here, this area, this part is not stained. This part is not stained. Why it is not stained? Because here is death of this myocardial area. The cells here are dead, subjected to extreme reduction in the blood flow or sudden occlusion of the coronary artery causes death of these myocardial cells. We call this infarction or ischemic necrosis. Ischemic necrosis or infarction due to sudden cutting of blood supply to this myocardial area. And it doesn't take the stain magenta because the cells when die, it ruptures and there is leakage of the enzyme. So it doesn't take the stain. Stress and injury affect not only the morphology, but also the functional status of cells and tissues. Thus, reversibly injured myocytes are not dead. Reversible injured are not dead and may resemble normal myocytes morphologically. However, they are transiently non-contractile. So, even mild injury can have a significant clinical impact. Cell death. Cell death is the ultimate result of cell injury and is one of the most crucial events in the evolution of disease in any tissue or organ. It results from various causes, maybe ischemia, infections, toxins, and immune reactions. Cell death also occurs in normal and essential process in embryogenesis, in the development of organs and the maintenance of homeostasis, and is the aim of cancer therapy. We treat cancer by causing death of these cells. Types of cell death. Cell death, two types. We have two types, necrosis and apoptosis. We'll have a brief idea on these necrosis and apoptosis, and I will give a separate video in details for necrosis and apoptosis. Necrosis is the type of cell death that occurs after abnormal stress such as ischemia, chemical injury, and it is always pathologic. Necrosis is always pathologic. While apoptosis means programmed cell death, means the cell suicide, or these cells programmed to die. This cells through activation of an internally controlled suicide program. It is designed to eliminate unwanted cells during embryogenesis and involution of hormone-responsive tissues after withdrawal of the hormone. It also occurs in certain pathological conditions. So apoptosis may be physiological and pathological. And we will have it in special detail in a separate video. Stress of different types may induce changes in cells and tissue other than the typical adaptation, cell injury, and cell death. Metabolic derangement in cells and sublethal chronic injury may be associated with intracellular accumulations of a number of substances, including proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. So we will have a separate video for this derangement, the cellular accumulations. Cellular accumulation, here is accumulation of lipids, but there may be accumulation of fats, maybe accumulation of carbohydrates. We will have a separate video for cellular accumulations. Calcium is often deposited at sites of cell death, resulting in pathologic calcification, and we call this dystrophic calcification. Here is a case of dystrophic calcification in the wall of the stomach. This is the wall of the stomach, and here is an artery, and this area, the calcification in the wall of the artery, and here is foci of calcification also. Here is calcification, these purple areas, bluish purple areas. This is foci of calcification in the submucosa. It occurs in dead tissues. Calcification occurs in dead tissues and is called dystrophic calcification. Well, I have given another case of calcification in the previous video of cell injury in aortic valve, calcified aortic valve. Subaortic valve, sometimes there is calcification in the cusps if the cusps are damaged. Finally, the normal process of aging itself is accompanied by characteristic morphologic and functional changes in cell. We will have a separate video for cell aging.